The first time she said she was selling the company, she didn't look at me. She said it casually, like she was talking about repainting the kitchen or replacing old furniture that had outlived its usefulness. "We can't keep living in the past," my stepmother said, standing at the head of the dining table my father had paid for. "Your father's business had a good run, but it's time to be realistic." My father had been dead for 11 days. The house still smelled like him. Old books, black coffee, engine oil that never quite washed out of his hands. His coat was still hanging by the door because no one had touched it yet. I noticed things like that. She didn't. She had already moved his photos into a drawer and replaced them with fresh flowers, the kind people buy when they want to look respectful without feeling anything. I sat there silently, hands folded, eyes down. I had learned early that silence made people careless, especially people who thought they'd already won. "The offer is generous, more than generous, actually, and frankly, I don't see you running this place. No offense." She finally looked at me then, a thin smile, polite, final. I nodded once, slowly, the way someone does when they're tired or defeated. That was the version of me she understood, the quiet stepson, the shadow in the room, the reminder of a man she'd married but never fully controlled. The company had been my father's life. 40 years of missed weekends, grease-stained notebooks, deals scribbled on napkins. I grew up there. I knew every machine, every contract, every employee by name. But I hadn't worked there for years. That was intentional. My father liked distance. He believed it kept things clean. "Do whatever you think is best," I said. Her shoulders relaxed. That was all she needed. The next week moved fast. Lawyers, buyers, meetings I wasn't invited to. I watched from the edges as men in clean suits walked through the factory floor, nodding like they were inspecting livestock. She laughed with them. She spoke about streamlining and modernizing, about how emotional attachment was bad for business. At the funeral, she cried just enough to be convincing. She held my arm when people were watching and let go the moment they weren't. Someone told me I was handling everything very well. I thanked them. I always thanked people. It kept them comfortable. After the burial, she leaned close and whispered, "You'll be taken care of course." I didn't ask what that meant. At night, alone in my old room, I went through my father's things. Not the obvious stuff, not the watches or the letters. I went where he kept things that mattered. Old files, outdated folders, documents no one else would bother reading. My father never threw anything away without a reason. There were meetings I remember him going to years ago. Just paperwork, boring adult stuff. Back then, I believed him. Now I read every line. She announced a sale date 2 weeks later, already celebrating, already spending money that wasn't hers yet. She invited people to the house, changed the locks on the office, started using the word "my" when she talked about the company. My decision, my signature, my future. I watched her sign papers without reading the fine print. I watched her interrupt lawyers who tried to explain things slowly. She didn't like to feel stupid. She preferred confidence over caution. The buyer shook her hand, smiled at me like I was furniture. No one asked why my father had insisted on certain clauses years ago. No one wondered why he separated ownership the way he had. No one checked what wasn't right in front of them, and I didn't correct them. I stayed quiet. I showed up when required. I signed what I was asked to sign. I played my role perfectly because my father had taught me one thing very clearly. If someone is in a hurry to erase the past, let them. They usually miss what's still standing in the present. That night, as my stepmother toasted to new beginnings with people who had already moved on to the next deal, I sat alone in the study and closed a folder I finished reading. For the first time since my father died, I wasn't grieving. I was waiting. The sale turned the house into a revolving door. People I'd never seen before walked through rooms I'd grown up in, carrying folders, laughing too loudly, talking about liquid assets and clean exits. My stepmother moved among them like she'd always belonged there, confident, rehearsed, already speaking in the past tense about my father. He was brilliant but stubborn, she'd say. He refused to adapt. She said it often enough that people nodded without questioning it. I stayed out of the way. I made coffee when asked. I listened more than I spoke. That made them comfortable. Comfortable people forget to hide things. The first buyer backed out quietly. No explanation. She brushed it off, said they weren't serious enough. The second one didn't. They sent lawyers. Lots of them. Younger, sharper, less impressed by her confidence. They asked questions she didn't like. Why is ownership structured this way? Why does this entity exist? Why was this clause added so late? She answered quickly, impatiently. She hated pauses. Pauses felt like weakness. I recognized the structure immediately. I had seen it before, years ago, when my father had taken me to lunch and talked about nothing important. Or so I thought at the time. He'd spoken in metaphors about redundancy, about control, about never letting emotion dictate leverage. At the end of that lunch, he'd said, "If something ever happens to me, don't rush. Watch who rushes instead." The deal moved forward anyway. Money has a way of silencing doubts when people think they're still in control. The signing happened on a Friday. Champagne, smiles, photos. She wore black, not for mourning, but because she thought it looked powerful. She didn't invite me to the table. I wasn't needed. By Monday, things started to change. The buyers delayed transferring the final payment. Small issue, they said. Technical, a formality. She pretended not to care, but I saw how often she checked her phone, how short her temper became, how quickly she turned on the lawyers she trusted days earlier. On Wednesday, she slammed her office door for the first time. On Thursday, she asked me if I knew anything about my father's old holding company. I looked at her like I didn't understand the question. "I mentioned it once," I said, "years ago. I thought it was dissolved." Her face tightened for half a second before she smoothed it over. "Yes, of course. That's what the records say." That night, I pulled the folder from my bag and read it again. Slowly. Carefully. Every signature, every date, every quiet decision my father had made while everyone else assumed he was losing control. He hadn't been losing it. He'd been distributing it. The buyers requested a meeting. Urgent. She called it an inconvenience. She dressed carefully anyway. Power always dresses carefully when it senses a threat. I sat in the corner of the conference room while they spoke. No one asked me to leave. No one asked me to stay. I was irrelevant. That was useful. "We need clarification," one of them said, calm but firm. "There's a discrepancy regarding voting rights." My stepmother smiled. "There must be a misunderstanding." "There isn't." They slid documents across the table. Copies. Clean. Official. I watched her read them. I watched recognition dawn slowly, like a bruise surfacing under skin. "That's not possible," she said. "It is," the lawyer replied. "And it changes everything." For the first time since my father died, she looked at me not as an obstacle, not as an inconvenience, but as an unknown. I met her eyes and said nothing, because now she understood something very important. She hadn't sold the company. She'd only sold the part she controlled. After that meeting, the house went quiet in a way I hadn't heard since the night my father died. No phone calls, no laughter, no guests. Just the sound of doors closing a little too hard and footsteps pacing late into the night. My stepmother stopped pretending I wasn't there. That was the first real shift. People ignore what they don't fear. She began asking questions. Not directly, not yet. She framed them as memories. "Your father was very secretive toward the end, wasn't he? He trusted you, I suppose. He never mentioned anything unusual to you." I answered carefully, truthfully, but narrowly. I never volunteered more than necessary. She wasn't looking for facts. She was looking for reassurance. I gave her none. The buyers froze the remaining funds. Officially, it was due diligence. Unofficially, it was leverage. They had realized too late that they'd bought uncertainty. That makes investors nervous. Nervous investors become aggressive. Letters started arriving, formal ones, cold ones. Requests for clarification turned into demands. Her lawyers stopped returning her calls as quickly. She accused them of incompetence. They suggested patience. She hated patience almost as much as she hated not being in control. One evening, she poured herself a drink and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "You knew," she said. It wasn't a question. I knew what? I asked. She stared at the glass in her hand like it might give her a better answer. That this wouldn't be simple. I let the silence stretch. Silence makes people fill it with truth. Your father never trusted me, she continued. Not completely. I can see that now. She waited for me to disagree. I didn't. The next morning, the buyers requested another meeting. This one included accountants, auditors, and someone introduced only as risk management. They spoke in careful language, but the meaning was clear. They wanted out or they wanted control. She couldn't give them either because control didn't belong to her anymore. It never really had. They asked who held the voting majority. The room went still. Everyone looked at her. She looked at the documents. Then, slowly, reluctantly, she looked at me. For the first time, she said my name. That's not possible, she said again, quieter now. He wouldn't do that without telling me. He didn't, the lawyer replied. He didn't need to. The meeting ended without resolution. That's when panic set in. Real panic, the kind that strips away confidence and leaves only instinct. She tried pressure first, guilt. This company is my future, she said. You wouldn't take that from me, not after everything. I thought of my father working late nights while she complained about being alone, of him paying for things she never valued, of how quickly she'd erased him once he was gone. I'm not taking anything, I said. I haven't done anything. That was the part she couldn't stand. I wasn't fighting her. I wasn't negotiating. I was just there, unmovable. Then came threats, subtle at first. Lawyers, court, public perception. She spoke like someone used to winning by intimidation. I listened. When that didn't work, she tried kindness, apologies, regret. She said she'd been overwhelmed, that grief made people make mistakes. She said family mattered more than money. I agreed. She smiled, thinking she'd found the right key. What she didn't understand was that family mattered to my father, too. That was why he'd planned so carefully, why he'd never trusted emotion alone to protect what he'd built. The buyers gave her an ultimatum: resolve the ownership issue or face legal action that would drag the company into court and turn her sale into a public mess. She had no move left, so she asked me to talk. We sat in my father's old office, his desk, his chair. She didn't sit down. She stood, restless, like the room rejected her. What do you want? She asked. I looked around once before answering, at the shelves, the photos she'd taken down, the space she tried to claim. I want what he wanted, I said. And what was that? I met her eyes. For you to never be able to touch this again. That was when she understood. Not everything ends with shouting. Some things end with paperwork, signatures, and the quiet realization that the ground has shifted and there's nothing left to stand on. She had sold the business thinking she was free. She hadn't noticed the door closing behind her. She didn't sleep that night. I know because I didn't either. And every time I passed the hallway, the light under her door was still on. By morning, she had a plan. It wasn't a good one. It was desperate, but desperation has a way of dressing itself up as strategy when there's no one left to tell you no. She tried to move fast, too fast. Emails went out to the buyers, to lawyers, to accountants who hadn't been part of the original deal. She talked about internal restructuring and temporary authority. She used words like interim and emergency, as if repeating them often enough would make them true. The buyers didn't respond. Instead, their legal team did. A formal notice arrived before noon. They were invoking a clause she'd barely skimmed: suspension of operational control pending clarification of majority ownership. In plain terms, the company was frozen. No hiring, no firing, no transfers, no decisions. She called it sabotage. I called it inevitable. I cornered me in the kitchen that afternoon. You could fix this, she said. Her voice was tight, measured. All you have to do is sign. Sign what? A temporary delegation of voting rights, just until this blows over. I looked at the document. My name was already typed at the bottom. You wrote this before asking me, I said. I was trying to be efficient. My father had hated that word when it was used as an excuse. "I'm not signing," I said. Her composure cracked, not fully, just enough to show the strain beneath it. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said. "You'll destroy everything he built." I almost laughed. That afternoon, the employees were sent home early. No explanation. Rumors spread fast in places like that. People talk. People worry. People remember who treated them well. My father had treated them well. By evening, the buyers requested a final meeting. No negotiation, no small talk. They wanted clarity, and they wanted it in writing. We sat in a glass conference room that reflected everything back at you: faces, postures, fear. The lead lawyer didn't bother with pleasantries. "Majority ownership needs to be confirmed," he said. "Now." I placed the folder on the table. I hadn't opened it in front of anyone before. I hadn't needed to. They read, slowly, carefully, the way people do when they realize their assumptions were expensive. The silence stretched. "This changes the sale," one of them said finally. "Yes," I replied. "It does." My stepmother stared at the table. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She knew better now. The buyers turned to her. "You sold what you didn't fully control. That exposes us, and it exposes you." She looked at me then, not with anger, with something closer to disbelief. "You planned this," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "He did." The meeting ended with conditions, strict ones. The sale would be revisited, control would be reassessed, and until then, nothing moved without my consent. Outside in the parking lot, she finally let the mask drop. "You think you've won. You think this makes you powerful." "I don't think about power. I think about endings." She turned away without another word. That night, I stood alone in the factory floor my father had built. The machines silent, the lights dimmed. It felt less like a victory and more like a handover. She had played the game loud and fast. My father had played it once, quietly, years ago. And now, it was my turn to finish it. She tried to move money the next morning. Not a lot, not enough to trigger alarms right away, just enough to give herself room to breathe. That was her mistake. People who have always had control think small moves go unnoticed. The transfer failed. By noon, her accounts were under review. By evening, her personal lawyer stopped answering her calls. The buyer's legal team had moved faster than she expected, and this time they weren't bluffing. They weren't angry either. They were protecting themselves, which is far more dangerous. She accused me of orchestrating it. "You've been talking to them behind my back," she said, pacing the living room like a trapped animal. "I haven't," I replied. "They don't need me to see the problem." She laughed, sharp and humorless. "You think they care about you? You're just a tool to them." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm a tool with leverage." That was when she realized this wasn't about reclaiming the company anymore. It was about survival. The buyers issued a formal notice of breach. They cited misrepresentation, inaccurate disclosures, failure to declare full ownership. Words that sound abstract until they're attached to your name. Her name. They demanded restitution. Not later, not negotiated, immediate. She couldn't pay it. The house suddenly felt too large, too exposed. She stopped inviting people over. She stopped answering the door. She started watching the street from the window like someone expecting consequences to arrive on four wheels. She tried one last approach. She sat across from me at the table and folded her hands like we were equals. "Let's be practical," she said. "We can still fix this together." "Together how?" "You transfer your shares. I stabilize the situation. Once this blows over, we can renegotiate." She spoke slowly, carefully, like she was explaining something to a child. I shook my head. "You're still thinking this ends with you in control." Her eyes hardened. "And you're still thinking this is about your father." "It is, just not in the way you think." The buyers requested arbitration. Public, documented, unavoidable. The kind of process that doesn't care about intentions, only signatures. During the preliminary hearing, her confidence evaporated. She interrupted. She contradicted herself. She argued emotion where facts were required. I said very little. When I did speak, it was only to confirm documents already on record. My father's voice echoed in my head the entire time. Not his words, his patience. By the end of the week, the buyers had their answer. They would not proceed under the original terms. They would proceed under mine. She wasn't part of the conversation anymore. That night, she packed a suitcase. "I never thought you were capable of this," she said out the door. I looked at her once. Really looked at her. The person who thought erasing someone was the same as defeating them. "I never thought about you at all," I said. The door closed behind her softly. No drama, no shouting. Just the sound of someone leaving a place they no longer belong to. She didn't come back for her things. At first, I thought she would. People like her always believe they'll return once emotions settle, once leverage shifts, once someone realizes they've made a mistake. But days passed, then weeks, and the house stayed quiet. Too quiet, like a place that had already been written out of someone's future. The arbitration moved faster without her. Once she was removed as a decision maker, everything became simple, brutally simple. The buyer stopped posturing. The lawyer stopped arguing hypotheticals. The numbers were laid out cleanly, without sentiment. The conclusion was obvious. The deal she'd signed was voidable. Not illegal, just fragile, built on assumptions that collapsed the moment someone bothered to check who actually had the final word. I exercised it. The buyers weren't happy, but they were pragmatic. They could either fight a public battle they were likely to lose, or they could restructure quietly and walk away with something intact. Corporations prefer quiet losses to loud defeats. We renegotiated. New terms, new timeline, my conditions. The company stayed intact. No mass layoffs, no asset stripping. The parts my father had protected remained untouched. The rest was reshaped, modernized in ways that didn't erase the past but didn't worship it either. They asked me once why I hadn't intervened sooner. Because, I said, some mistakes need to be completed before they can be undone. By the time the paperwork was finalized, her name had been removed from everything that mattered. Accounts, authority, records. Even the internal history of the company listed her tenure as transitional. A footnote. She tried to call once, a block number, late at night. I let it ring. The next morning, her lawyer sent a message asking for a meeting. I declined. There was nothing left to discuss. She had sold a future she didn't own, and the past she'd tried to erase had closed around her quietly, efficiently, without malice. I walked the factory floor again, this time with the new board. They asked questions, real ones. They listened. I answered without rushing, without performing. When we passed the old office, someone asked if I planned to redecorate. No, I said. It works as it is. That afternoon, I opened my father's last folder one final time. Inside was a short note I hadn't noticed before. Not legal, not formal, just his handwriting. Control isn't taken. It's kept. I closed the folder and put it back where it belonged. There was only one thing left to do. And it didn't involve her at all. The last thing I did was the only thing she never expected. I didn't punish her. I didn't sue her. I didn't expose her publicly. I didn't take her to court and drag her name through headlines. I erased her. Quietly. Completely. Once the buyers stepped back under the new terms, I assumed interim control and began auditing everything she had touched. Contracts, vendors, consultants, side agreements signed in a rush, often with people who had no long-term interest in the company at all. Every shortcut she'd taken showed up eventually. Fees that made no sense, middlemen who added nothing, advisors who disappeared the moment they were asked to justify their invoices. One by one, those relationships ended. No accusations, no drama, just notices. When people asked why she was gone, the answer was always the same. She's no longer involved. That phrase followed her everywhere. Banks, boards, networks, rooms she used to walk into confidently now went quiet when her name was mentioned, then moved on without her. Influence only exists when people believe it does. She tried to re-enter the industry under a new title, a new venture, a fresh start. It failed before it began. No one said no to her directly, they simply didn't return calls. Reputation doesn't shatter, it dissolves. The house sold within a month, not because I needed the money, but because it had never been mine. It had been my father's, and then hers, briefly, like a costume she wore too confidently. I kept one thing, the desk. I moved it into the office and left everything else behind. On the day the final documents were filed, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. I didn't know, it read. He never told me. You didn't have to do this. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing it. She was right about one thing. I didn't have to. I chose to. Because some people don't lose when they're confronted. They lose when they're made irrelevant. One last signature went through that afternoon. The company was mine. Fully. Cleanly. Not as revenge, as correction. I didn't attend the closing dinner. There was no reason to celebrate. What had been settled wasn't a victory, just the return to order. The company moved forward without announcements or speeches. Employees came in the next morning and did their jobs. Machines turned on. Emails were answered. Life continued. That was how my father would have wanted it. A week later, I visited his grave alone. No flowers, no words rehearsed in advance. I stood there longer than I expected to, thinking about how little he trusted appearances and how much he trusted preparation. She never showed up. Not there, not anywhere that mattered. I heard about her later through someone who used to know both of us. She'd moved cities, changed circles, took a consulting role that sounded impressive but carried no weight. Titles can be bought. Authority can't. The company thrived quietly. We expanded where it made sense, cut what didn't. People who had worked under my father stayed. New ones came in without trying to erase the old names on the walls. The past wasn't worshipped. It was respected. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the office she once claimed as hers. The desk was empty, the walls bare. No trace of her decisions remained. Not because I'd destroyed them, but because they'd never been solid enough to last. I locked the door behind me and turned off the light. Revenge isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand an audience. Sometimes it's just watching someone realize too late that the ground they were standing on was never theirs, and walking away, knowing the story is finally over.